Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to lecture number 9 of Software Requirements Engineering, CSC305. And in today's lecture, we are going to continue our discussion on requirements elicitation process. Let's have a quick recap of how far we have gone on our discussion about the elicitation process. If you guys remember, we started our discussion with what is a process, and then we tried to define an elicitation process, what it is. We said that elicitation process is a staged process where the first stage is that we try to identify right kind of people, and then we try to define their objectives, and in the end the final stage was to gather stakeholder requirements. And then we started discussing various elicitation techniques. We started off with interviews, then we talked about, in our previous lecture specifically, we talked about scenarios, observation and social analysis, and then we also talked about prototyping. So what was scenarios? We are familiar with this word scenario, specifically if we think about use cases. Then we said use case is a special kind of diagram which is kind of a scenario. So we can say that a use case represents multiple scenario, or multiple use cases represents one scenario. Either way, it's some people say that multiple use cases are used to express one scenario, whereas some people suggest that a use case is a scenario. So use cases is a special diagram which shows a particular usage scenario. So for example, when we talk about scenarios, then we think about different actions that a user is taking within the system. For example, let's talk about course registration. Now, when we think about a student registering a course, and we want to model it as a scenario, then we talked about that there are 5 things that we need to ensure that a scenario must have. So a scenario should have a precondition or the state of the system before the scenario begins. Then it should have flow of events. Okay, so how the user would interact with the system, what events would occur throughout this particular scenario. Then it should also include the ending state of the scenario. Then if there are any exceptions, then they should also be indicated. If there are any variations, they should also be indicated. So that was scenario. And scenarios are normally a very good way of modeling how a user might interact with the system. And one very interesting thing that I don't know whether I've emphasized on it in my previous lectures or not, that these elicitation techniques, they are not mutually exclusive. So when we say we are conducting interviews, and when we have these focus groups, and when we have these scenarios, so it doesn't mean that, if we are doing one technique, then we are not going to do the other one. So these techniques they complement each other, and it's a combination of these techniques that a requirement analyst would use to elicit requirements from a client. So they are not mutually exclusive. That's why the knowledge of these techniques is really important. Otherwise, we can be done with one technique and that's it. But the reason why we discuss all these different techniques is because they all complement each other. Okay, and the next thing that we discussed in our last lecture was observation and social analysis. So requirement elicitation through observation and social analysis. And we said that in ethnographic studies, it's basically what happens is that an ethnographer would go and he would start observing people. And one thing that an ethnographer should do during this observation and social analysis, that he takes lots of notes, because he is just observing people, and at the end, once for example, he has to be there at a client site for a day, and he observed certain people performing certain steps. What he would do, he would make his own map. He would try to say that, okay, this is what I think how these people are using the system. And then what happens is that there is always a debriefing session. So ethnographer would then present his analysis to some people who are outside the process, and then he will take their input on it, and if required, he will go back and do a more focused observation again to actually refine his analysis or his initial analysis through this observation part. And the final technique that we discussed in our last lecture was prototyping. And we are familiar with prototyping a lot. We have been talking about this technique. You guys should be familiar with this in your, or this topic should have been introduced to you guys in your software engineering course. And this is one of the traditional software development lifecycle models as well, which is the prototyping model. And the idea here is that you create a prototype of the product and you show it to a client. And by looking at that that prototype, a client can actually filter, what kind of features he desires and what features he does not require in that particular software. So prototyping is a very useful way of eliciting requirements. But then we talked about that there are two kind of prototypes. One is a throwaway prototype and the other one is the executable prototype. And then there is difference between the two. The throwaway prototype is done only for those requirements which are not clear. So if there are certain requirements which you after applying multiple elicitation techniques, you cannot get around them, that what does the client want. So prototyping is a solution in that case, that you actually do a quick prototype and show it to the client. But the purpose here is to understand unclear requirements, and that's why it's called a throwaway prototype, that you just gain that understanding and then you get rid of that prototype. And because why we throw it away, actually, because if you guys remember, then I told you that we do it because what happens in this throwaway prototype is that we have some initial requirements, but they are not clear. So these requirements, they are unclear, and on the basis of these requirements, because these requirements are unclear and we have not been able to understand them, what we do is we do a quick implementation. So we do an implementation, and this implementation is actually our prototype. And on the basis of this prototype, we show it to the client, and then whatever the client would tell us, that whether this is right or this is wrong, we take this feedback and then we finalize our requirements. The reason why we throw it away, because we skip the design part. If you guys remember, then once you have the requirements, it doesn't matter which kind of methodology you're using, whether it's agile or whether it's a traditional software development lifecycle model, but there's always some sort of designing that you do, even though it may be very minimal design, but you do some sort of designing. So we skip the designing part. On the basis of requirements, we just did a quick prototype to show it to the client. So that's why we throw it away normally, and the purpose is to develop an understanding of unclear requirements. Whereas the other kind of prototyping, which is executable prototype, that is normally done because we want to give some functional product to the client. Okay, and we will create an executable prototype only for those requirements which are very clear. So let's say we have set of requirements and we have a very thorough understanding of how what would happen in this particular case, and we are clear about the statements and everything. So okay, we'll say, okay, from this list of 10 requirements, I have these 3 requirements which I'm very clear about and I have no ambiguity to, so let's implement them and give it to the client. So executable prototype is only done for those requirements which are very clear to you and there is no confusion in them. So those were the 3 techniques that we discussed. Towards the end, we also talked about requirement reuse. So another elicitation technique, we said not an elicitation technique, but it is something which actually complements this whole requirement elicitation process, is requirements reuse. And we said that there are lots of advantages of reuse. Mainly, we can think of that when we are reusing requirements, then we are saving time, we are saving money, and so it's a good thing. But the problem is that there is no formal way of reusing requirements. It is done informally, but there is no formal way of saying that, okay, we can reuse requirements and these are the things that we need to do in order to reuse them properly. But we said that there are multiple scenarios in which requirements can be reused. For example, our client has its own standards and its own standard way of doing things, then those standard requirements can be reused from one software to the other software. And similarly, if you're a software house and you have done similar projects in the past, then maybe you can take those set of requirements, and you can reuse them. So if you're in similar application domain, then maybe those requirements can be reused. So there are problems and there are benefits of requirement reuse, and this is also used. This also complements these different elicitation techniques. So do remember that point which I suggested, that none of these techniques are not mutually exclusive. They can be used in combination with each other. Okay, so let's quickly think about this scenario exercise, because I thought it's also interesting if we do these things. Now let's write a scenario for registering a course for university. I have discussed it multiple times. Now I want you guys to think about it. Take a couple of minutes and let's think about what is the initial state of the system, what would be the final state of the system, and what are the events that a user would do when he or she is registering a course. So let's take a couple of minutes and you guys think about it, and then I will discuss the solution with you. So the first thing that a student would do once he logs into the portal, so maybe you can say the initial state of the system is that a user is logged in. Okay, then the first event that would occur is that a student would do is he would choose a course from the course handbook or the website. So the list of offered courses would be there. Then the student would particularly he would select a particular course. Then the next thing that he would do is collect registration form or download that web form, complete the registration form, submit the registration form for checking, and accept registration confirmation. Now, if you guys remember, then let's say that these are the different events that let's say that these are the different events that occur in a scenario, in this particular scenario of registering a course. And I said that the initial state in this particular case can be that student is logged in, and the final state is that registration is complete for that student. Okay, so in this case we say, okay, the scenario is complete. But there are other things in the scenario, and we said that a couple of things, that each action can have an exception. So for example, when he is downloading this particular registration form or the web form, then what can happen is that the download it doesn't allow him to download that particular form, and when he tries to complete the registration, then maybe he has left some mistakes in the form, and these kind of things. And similarly, so when he submits this form for checking, then there may be some inconsistencies. For example, he selected a course and there are certain prerequisites for that course, and he has not actually passed those courses to register a new course. So there would be an error shown that, okay, you need to reselect your courses that you want to register. So whenever you are modeling a scenario, think about the initial state of the system and how the system would change after this particular scenario complete. That would be the ending state of that particular scenario. And the next thing we think about is the normal flow of events, and then we also try to think about what exceptions might occur when that event is occurring in this in any particular scenario. So that was just a quick scenario example. So let's see what we are going to do in our lecture today. We are going to continue with elicitation process, and we are going to talk about some more elicitation techniques very briefly. We are going to talk about document studies. We are going to talk about questionnaire, brainstorming, focus groups, and if you guys remember these two techniques, collaborative requirement gathering and quality function deployment, we talked about them in our initial lectures. So we are going to discuss them very briefly again, and then finally we are also going to discuss analysis, requirement analysis and negotiation that occurs during the elicitation process, and why it is important, and what kind of analysis is done, and how negotiation is conducted when we are eliciting requirements or during this elicitation process. So what are document studies? Document studies are used to cross-check the interview information. It is a fast way to get information about the data in the old database. The analyst studies existing documents such as forms, letter files, computer logs, and documentation of the existing computer system. He may also print screen dumps from the existing system. So this is very interesting, and this is a very interesting way of gathering requirements. So what happens is that you have taken you have done your interviews, but if you guys once you guys get to that stage of your careers, and you become a requirement analyst, and you go and talk to people and you conduct interviews, you guys will realize that when you are conducting an interview, then these interviews are really raw, and you cannot straight away listen to an interview and say, okay, these are the 10 requirements that I have gathered from this particular interview. It takes a lot of time. You have to go through that interview again and again. You have to prescribe it, you have to document it, and then you say, okay, this is the useful information that I can get from this particular interview. But document studies, they are not only restricted to interviews. You also go and look for any other information that you have. So for example, we talked about requirements reuse. So any other documentation that you have, you have any letters, you have any computer logs, or you have any other information, like said that you can take screen dumps from the existing system. So any other information that you have, you go through it, you analyze it, and try to elicit any information that you can from those existing documents. Similarly, you can also use your old database to extract some information. So document studies just mean that we are trying to gather some knowledge based on what is already out there. Okay, so discussing knowledge aspect, it is very interesting. And when we talk about knowledge, then there are two kinds of knowledge which are available out there. One is implicit knowledge, and the other is explicit knowledge. And people acquire knowledge in you know, when they either the knowledge is, so implicit knowledge means that I have learned some tricks from my experience. For example, I'm a very good debugger, and I've not documented it anywhere that how to debug code, but I have that skill. So that knowledge is implicit with me. Whereas, for example, you know, I've also written a template for writing requirements. Now that was my knowledge, but I have written, because I have prepared that particular template, so I've made that knowledge explicit. So these are two examples of implicit and explicit knowledge. So what happens is that, you know, for example, these document studies, it's an example of that explicit knowledge that is out there, and you're trying to apply something from it and gain an understanding, and based on your understanding you are again writing some requirements. So you acquire knowledge by reading and understanding the stuff that is out there, and based on your understanding you write some set of requirements. And that's why that analysis and negotiation part is there, because when I try to get that knowledge, acquire that knowledge from the different sources, then I develop my own understanding, but my understanding may be inconsistent with what the client wants. So that's why we need to share it with the client, and we need to negotiate, and when we are finalizing requirement, that's why these steps are really important even in the elicitation stage. So that is what we do when we say we document studies, and how do we elicit requirements through them. So next up is questionnaires. So why are questionnaires used? They are used to get information from many people. They can be used in two possible ways: to get statistical evidence for an assumption, or to gather opinions and suggestions. So for example, the first one, or the statistical use, where we have made an assumption, and we are trying to gather some data to actually say that whether our assumption is wrong or it is correct. So for example, people can ask questions such as, how easy is it to get customer statistics from with the present system? Very difficult, quite difficult, easy, very easy. So you can define a scale, and you can ask multiple questions. For example, you can have usability related question, you can have performance related questions, you can have reliability related questions, and you can have a scale. That from a scale from 1 to 5, you can develop a Likert scale, that okay, from a scale from 1 to 5, how do you rate the system? And now you have made certain hypotheses about the system, that there are certain problems with the existing system, and based on this survey, let's say you conduct this survey throughout the organization, and based on your findings you would say, okay, my assumptions were correct or they were wrong, and on the basis of those assumptions you will finalize your requirements. Then the next kind of questionnaire, the next kind of these surveys is to gather opinions and suggestions. So what kind of questions you can ask? That what are the 3 biggest problems in your daily work? What are your suggestions for better IT support of your daily work? So this is kind of, you know, this is an example of an open-ended and a closed-ended question, which we discussed when we talked about interviews. That when we are gathering opinions and suggestions, then we are basically asking people a question, and we are not restricting their answer, and we are saying, okay, tell us what are the main problems that you face in your daily tasks, and how can what according to you would be a better IT system, or how can the system be improved? And you know, these kind of questions, they're open-ended questions, and we are trying to take as much input as we can from different people to increase our understanding of the system. So questionnaires are, what is the advantage of using a questionnaire over an interview? We can gather lots of data through questionnaires. Okay, given that people fill these, but there is always a question mark over the validity of the data that you gather through questionnaires, because you cannot be sure that whether the questionnaire was filled by the right person or not, because you either email the questionnaire, or you drop it with the person whom you want to fill the questionnaire, or you can make a website where people can log in and answer and give theirs and fill the questionnaire. But the validity is always a question mark, but it is a very convenient way, and you can get lots of responses. For example, it might take 3 to 4 hours to conduct a good interview, whereas you can have 100 or 200 questionnaires filled in the same time, if given that you have that kind of people who are ready to fill those forms. But again, as I said, that there are always question marks about the validity of the data gathered through questionnaires, but that's also a very efficient way of sort of getting an initial feeling that what does the client want. So maybe before you finalize, and before you say okay, when you're selecting stakeholders, or before actually going for those specific focus group sessions or collaborative requirement gathering sessions, it's a good idea to do a suggestion or an opinion survey, and you make a questionnaire which is kind of very generic, and you float it around in the company and get that feedback and prepare yourself based on that feedback. Because once you will be prepared, you would know, okay, that these people said that these are the problems with this IT system, and then you think about those problems and try to say, okay, I need to ask more questions about these kind of things in my focus group session, and I need to discuss these things more elaborately in my interviews. So it's always a good idea, and you need to actually figure out that when and where it is appropriate to use which elicitation technique. So as I said, that questionnaires and these they can be important when you are trying to gain some insight into the existing system. Similarly, once you have deployed your system and you want to take feedback from the client, then again questionnaires are a very good source. Then you want to see, okay, how do the people rate my new system? Is it better than the others, the older system, or is it worse? Or you again can make a scale and you try to collect data, and based on that data you can do some statistical analysis that, okay, how many people think that the new system is better than the older system. So it's important to actually figure out that what should be the timing of this questionnaire and where it will be helpful for you to elicit requirements. The next up is brainstorming. So what happens in a brainstorming session is that the whole requirement engineering team, they gather together with a group of people, and what you try to do is you try to simulate people's brains, and it's always a very focused atmosphere. And you would say, okay, that let's think about the solutions to the registration problem, and let's think about the solutions to the the attendance problem, and but the main idea is in brainstorming is that you don't ridicule any idea. So all the inputs, all the ideas are accepted, because if you try to make fun of somebody's idea, then he is not going to say anything in the brainstorming session. So the whole point is that whatever the idea is, you should just say people, okay, think more. What do you think? And the idea is that you're trying to involve people, and you're trying to stimulate them, and you're trying to encourage them to come up with new ideas, and you try to record all those things, because some of those things might be very exciting and might be very useful. And what happens is that in all those brainstorming sessions, there is always a facilitator who would be conducting the meeting. So you don't want lots of people talking at the same time, because then you will not be able to record it. So as a facilitator, you want to record everything, as I said. So whatever somebody is suggesting, you're trying to record it as well. So there would always be a facilitator who would be responsible for recording what the other people are suggesting. So an important rule of the game is not to criticize any idea. So as I already said it, that you don't criticize any idea, and even seemingly stupid ideas may turn out to have a valuable diamond seed in them. So I mean, it's very philosophical, but yeah, you can have that. For example, somebody suggests something which might on the face of it looks very stupid and very naive, but when you think about that thing later on, then you actually realize, okay, that was actually quite brilliant. So it does happen, and the facilitator may finish the session with a joint round where participants prioritize the idea. So this is also a very good idea that normally brainstorming sessions are very important when you are, for example, thinking about something which nobody knows how to solve a particular problem, but that's a new thing which the client wants in the system. For example, normally in the universities, taking attendance is a very tedious job. So for example, here we need to ensure that people are taking attending the classes, and these kind of things. Now there are multiple solutions which can solve this particular problem. So you don't want to name call all the students, because what would happen, this would take a lot of time. So let's say you have a class of 100 students, and it is going to take a lot of time, and it will waste it would waste very precious lecture time of, let's say, 15 minutes. You don't want that. So what do you want? Okay, you want to conduct a brainstorming session where you ask all the stakeholders, you bring some students, you bring some faculty members, you bring some administrators, and you are the facilitator, and you say, okay, let's start thinking about it. What is the solution to this attendance problem? Now somebody would say, okay, we can take an image of the class, and we can do we can identify different people, and through that we can tick mark the attendance. Somebody would suggest, okay, you know, we can give the students RFID cards, and each student should scan the card when they're entering the room, and these kind of things. So there can be lots of different solutions which people might suggest to you, and then based on those solutions you will ask them, okay, what would happen in this particular solution, what are the requirements for that? So you kind of go into depth of those solutions as well. But what you would do, and what is important for you as a facilitator when you are conducting this brainstorming session, is that you want to take something home, and you want to say, okay, this is my preferred solution, and what kind of requirements do you think are better? So you try to prioritize all the things which are being suggested by different stakeholders, so that when you end this brainstorming session, you have some concrete set of requirements which you can say, okay, through this session I have identified that these things are going to be in my solution. So that is the purpose. So brainstorming is a very interesting and a very exciting way of gathering data, and you would be surprised how effective it is, because normally to start people off is very difficult, to break the ice is very difficult, but when this session is underway, then and when you encourage people to say whatever they want to say about the solution, then you would be surprised that how enterprising and how unique solutions people suggest to different problems. So it's a very interesting way of thinking about a problem where nobody has a clue, or a process doesn't used to exist, or you want to completely renovate the process or re-engineer the process. For example, as I said, that the manual way of taking attendance is that you name call everybody, every student in the class, and as I said, it wastes lots of time, and now you want to automate it, and so you have a brainstorming session. So next up is focus groups. Focus groups, they resemble those brainstorming sessions, but are more structured. It starts with a phase where the participants come up with problems in the current way of doing things. Next comes a phase where participants try to imagine an ideal way of doing things. The group also tries to explain why the ideas are good, which helps formulate goals and requirements for the new system. At the end of the session, each group identifies the high priority issues. When later prioritizing the requirements, it is important that each stakeholder group gets solutions to some of their high priority issues. If a stakeholder group doesn't get anything in return, they are rarely willing to contribute to the system. So let's look at these things in detail. Number one, we know that focus groups, they are very similar to brainstorming. Okay, but the difference between brainstorming and a focus group session is that focus groups are more formal. Okay, and we normally divide it into different phases, and what would happen is that we have different sets of people sitting, and for example, we have students, faculty, and administration, and we have asked them, okay, please tell us, and it's a very focused meeting. We have informed them that, and we are asking them that you use this system, or you use the current system. What are the flaws in the current system? So the first phase is that each of those groups, they identify the problems with the existing system. So that is the first phase. So you come up with the problems. So each or the groups of the participants, they come up with the problems. That is the first phase. The next phase is that they try to imagine an ideal way of doing things. Ideal way of doing things. That is the next phase. And the group, they also try to mention that why these ideas are good. So they also try to explain the rationale. That why do they think that the ideal way that they have suggested, why is that good, okay, or why it would work, and this rationale is actually important when we are finalizing requirements for a new solution. And at the end of this session, each group would prioritize those. So there are three things. Number one is they come up with the problems, then they tell that according to them what is the ideal way of doing it, and then they say they try to give a rationale of their ideal way. Why do they think that this is the ideal way of doing it? Then they try to prioritize those issues as well. So an important thing in the focus group session is that once the participants have mentioned their problems, and they have also suggested that what is the ideal way of solving this problem, and then they have also prioritized different issues, it is very important as a facilitator that towards the end of this session you try to give a solution to the stakeholders who have came into the meetings and who have spent their time and who have thought about this problem, and they have told you lots of their problems. Now you as a facilitator, it's your job to give them some feedback on the problems that they have identified. So you need to tell them, okay, that these were your problems, and according to me, we can solve this problem in this fashion, or this would be done in this fashion, because they want to take something back. So they want to feel that they have taken something back in return as well. So this is what should happen in a focus group. So we know that focus group, they are very similar to brainstorming sessions, but they are more formal. So you would divide it into multiple phases, where in the initial phase people come and they try to think of what are the problems with their current way of doing things. Then they imagine an ideal solution, then they try to give rationale of that ideal solution, and then they prioritize their issues. And this is very helpful when you are trying to finalize the requirements. Another elicitation technique is that you try to study similar companies, or you try to go and talk to people in similar organizations. Why we do it? This is one of the best sources of realistic ideas, that how the other companies, they are handling similar problems. Because, for example, you go to a company who is let's talk about this learning management system. So, for example, there are multiple universities in the city where you are stationed, and you got a project of one particular university, but you know that the other universities, they also register students, they also conduct exams, they also take attendance. So you might go and talk to the people there, and you try to see how they are conducting their processes. Similarly, you are doing a project for a construction company, and you go and talk to you go and see how the other construction company is dealing with things. Now, one of the problems that might happen is that people may not be very welcoming, and they may not tell you how they are doing things. But if you can gather something from other companies, then it's always a very good idea, because it will be interesting, because others might have thought about the solution that you have to incorporate in your project. So a study of their procedures and comparison with your own can give you many ideas. So this is why it is interesting. And most importantly, a visit to to their site makes it easier to imagine how the new system could work. So this is also very important. But as I said that those other companies, they might be reluctant to share knowledge, because they might say, okay, this is my secret solution, and I don't want to share it with you, or I don't want they don't welcome you. So another way of going around it is that there are lots of international auditing and consultancy firms. Now they have data, or they have the benchmark studies that how the others perform, or how the performance of the other companies in the similar area is, and you can maybe acquire their services, and you can take some data from them. You would have to pay for it, but it's always a good idea to compare your solution with another existing solution, because when you benchmark it, then you feel more confident about what you have devised, whether this is going to work or not. And this is what elicitation is about, that you perceive a solution, and you try to perceive it in a way that you satisfy your client. Okay, and when you are trying to satisfy your client, and if you have these benchmarks, then you will be more confident, and you will say, okay, my solution is better than any solution out there. And in order to actually claim that, you need to actually know about the other existing solutions. So that's why studying other similar companies is very important, and it gives you more confidence in your perceived solution, and that in a way that you're approaching a problem. And once you do these benchmark studies, it gives you a very clear picture of how to go about a particular solution. So then there are a few other techniques that we briefly talked about, and we touched upon them. So let's quickly see what they were about. So collaborative requirement gathering, we have seen multiple examples of collaborative requirement gathering actually. For example, those focus groups and brainstorming sessions, they are examples of collaborative requirement gathering. And what collaborative requirement gathering means is that you conduct a session where you have multiple people sitting together, and you have a facilitator. So it's very similar to a brainstorming and maybe a focus group sessions. But the idea is that you normally set an agenda. So focus group is a more ideal example of collaborative requirement gathering, that you give people an agenda, and then they come prepared for the sessions, and then you try to elicit as many requirements as you can. But then there is one thing, that you always have a recording mechanism when you are doing this collaborative requirement gathering session. That and there are different modernized way of conducting these collaborative requirement gathering sessions. You can have these sessions virtually. For example, you can have people sitting in a chat room, or you can have people on Skype or on those different so lots of people are sharing, and you share different ideas. Similarly, you can have an online requirement portal where different people are suggesting, okay, this is what I think about this problem, and then another person who has another opinion about that solution, he can come and comment on what other person suggested. And then so there are different ways in which this collaborative requirement gathering has evolved recently. So that is collaborative requirement gathering, that you have lots of people sitting together and they share their ideas and try to record it. So a recording mechanism is very important when you have these collaborative requirement gathering sessions. So if you are having that session in a big conference room, then what kind of mechanisms, recording mechanism you can use? You can maybe have a whiteboard, or you can give post-its to different people, and whatever ideas they are coming up with, you can ask them, okay, please note them on the post-its and paste them on the wall. So towards the end of the session, you gather all those ideas, and then you try to summarize and share with all the people who are there in that collaborative requirement gathering session. So another technique that we briefly talked about was quality function deployment, and as I said, that this is a technique which is used in engineering discipline a lot. And what you try to do is you try to come up with customer wishes, and you try to come up with the technical features that customer want in the product. So there are two kinds of requirements that any solution would have. One are the wishes of the client. So a client might want his product to be cheap, he might want his product to be strong, he might want his product to be safe, but on the other hand, he also wants some technical features which are conflicting to that safety feature, or which are conflicting to that cheap price feature or wishes. So there are two kinds of things that a client would want. On one hand, a client may have some technical features that he desires in the product. So he might want some technical features, and on the other hand, he might have some wishes, or we can call them, let's say we call them clients requirements. Okay, so let's say these are the requirements that the client want, and then he has some technical features as well which he wishes that his products have. So what you try to do is you have identified these things, that these are the requirements from my client and these are the technical features that he desires. Now you try to say that, okay, which of these technical features they actually conflict with those wishes. So if there are any conflicts between a technical feature and a requirement, you put a negative sign there. But if it complements, but if a requirement complements a certain technical feature, then you put a plus there. So by doing so, you would say that what are the conflicts in the different requirements that you have identified, because remember that these technical features and these wishes, they are all requirements. Okay, now that is a very good way of solving those conflicts and identifying ambiguities, because on the one hand, the client say that he wants the final product to be cheap, but on the other hand, he is demanding some features which once implemented would mean that the product would be very expensive. So there is a conflict. And then another thing, then what you do is that, how do you say that, okay, for example, there is a conflict in T1 and R1. Okay, now there is a conflict in these two requirements. If you want R1, then T1 cannot be achieved, or T1 cannot be done in a way that the client desires. So how would you resolve it? So there are two things that you do. You try to compare your product. You do a competitor analysis as well. So you do some sort of benchmarking. So you have your competitor data here as well. So you try to rate your existing product, or you try to rate your product, the way you want to launch the product in comparison to your competitor. So for example, you know that your competitor's technical feature benchmark was 5, and let's say 5 is better than 4, and you want yours to be 7. And whereas in terms of R1, your client was at 3, your competitor was at 3, but the client wants himself, he doesn't care actually whether it's a 2 or a 4 there, where 4 is better than 3, and the higher number is better than, let's say that the higher number is better. So based on this discussion, you actually, when you tell these figures to your client and you say, okay, according to our analysis, these are competitors in the market, and these are the values for technical feature of the competitor's product, and this is how the competitors deal with this particular wish that you have, or this R1 that you have. And if the client says, okay, I don't care about R1, but I really want this T1 the way I have mentioned, or I really want to improve on this technical feature. Now, if that is the case, you will give priority to this. And so basically, if there was a conflict, that conflict would be resolved. So this is a very ideal way of solving these conflicts. And QFT is not only limited to identifying the conflicts between wishes and features. You can also this is actually called house of quality. So you can also draw a comparison between these different technical features. So you can say that, you know, T1 and T2, and you will try to again put a plus and minus here depending on whether T1 and T2 they are conflicting with each other or not. So among those different technical features, you can also do this ambiguity, or do this conflict analysis, and based on your priority of different features. Now let's say out of these T1, T2, T3, T4, I say that, you know, I give priority to T1 and T4. So even if let's say there is a conflict between T1 and T2 and T3 and T4, then I would give more importance to T4 and T1, because I have, according to this competitor analysis, I've discussed it with the client, and he has said that I badly want technical feature 1 and technical feature 4, so I would give priority to these features. So quality function deployment is a very useful technique when you are eliciting requirements and you are kind of in the final stages of negotiation and resolving conflicts with the client. Then it's a very interesting way of resolving conflicts, because it gives you a proper or a more knowledgeable way of discussing the issues with the client, that okay, both of these are your requirements, this is your technical feature, and this is the wish that you have, that you want in the product, but if you want this, then this cannot be done in the amount of resources that you have. So what do you want more? And this is, according to us, where your competitors stand. So when you give these kind of information to the client, then he would be in a better position to make a decision and finalize the requirements. So this is a very ideal way of resolving these conflicts and resolving these kind of problems. And you also prioritize those requirements and features as well. So it can be taken as an input for further evaluation analysis, because you also prioritize your requirements based on this quality function deployment. So these are the different elicitation techniques, and I think that's more or less the techniques that we are going to discuss in this elicitation process. What I would ideally want in the next lecture, what I would try to do is that I would try to also share with you guys what is the state of art in this field. So there are lots of new interesting techniques that have been developed by different researchers, which they think are more feasible for eliciting requirements. And we are going to have, in our next lecture, we are going to talk about those techniques, that how researchers approach this problem, or what kind of new techniques that they have suggested. But in today's lecture, that is it from techniques. And now we are going to talk about analysis and negotiation within this elicitation process. So what is analysis? The goal of analysis is to discover problems, incompleteness and inconsistencies in the elicited requirements. Now, if you guys remember from our first lecture, when we started talking about this elicitation process, we said that we do some analysis checking, and we said that when we do that analysis checking, we try to identify those problematical requirements. And what are those problematical requirements? Number one is that the requirements are incomplete. Number two is that requirements are inconsistent, and number three is that the requirements are unnecessary. So so what we do is that when we do these analysis check, then from the set of elicited requirements, we identify three kind of requirements. We identify, number one, incomplete requirements. So that is the first kind of requirements that we identify. We also identify inconsistent requirements. We also identify unnecessary requirements. So by unnecessary requirements, we mean that these requirements cannot be done in the limited resources that you have. Inconsistent requirement, we mean that you have a requirement where one stakeholder is saying, okay, do this thing in this particular fashion, and the other stakeholder is suggesting something else, and those two are conflicting with each other and they're not consistent. And the third one is incomplete, that a certain thing, for example, a user say, one of the stakeholders says that the system should be easy to use. Now that is incomplete. What do you mean by easy to use? So try to complete that. So basically, when we do this analysis checking, then we identify these kind of problematical requirements, and then we take it back to the client in the negotiation step, where we say, okay, these are the problems that we have identified in the requirements that we gathered. So let's discuss and try to come up with a solution that how they will be finally included in the in the final product. So analysis is interleaved with the elicitation, as problems are discovered when the requirements are elicited. A problem checklist may be used to support analysis. Each requirement be assessed against the checklist. So what you can do, you can have a checklist, and you can say, okay, you go through each requirement and you try to say, okay, whether this requirement is incomplete, and you can have further checks within the incomplete, that how do you define that a requirement is incomplete. For example, if a requirement is qualitative, then you might say that, okay, it's incomplete. If the sentence doesn't make any sense, that you might suggest that the requirement is incomplete. Similarly, you can have lots of different features which according to you suggest that a requirement is inconsistent. And similarly, you can also have a checklist of things that how would you say that the requirement is necessary or not. So you can use these checklists to identify each requirement. So what we do is, let's say we have elicited 100 requirements. So what we do is we try to go through all those 100 requirements, and in this analysis phase we identify these problematical requirements. So what are these analysis checklist? One is the premature design. So for example, one thing that you might have on that checklist is, does the requirement include premature design or implementation information? Combined requirements, does the description of a requirement describe a single requirement, or could it be broken down into several different requirements? Unnecessary requirements, is the requirement gold plating, that is the requirement a cosmetic addition to the system which is not really required? Use of non-standard hardware, does the requirement mean that the non-standard hardware or the software must be used? To make this decision, you need to know the computer platform requirements. Then you have conformance with business goals. Is the requirement consistent with the business goal defined in the introduction to the requirement document? Requirements ambiguity, is the requirement ambiguous? That is, could it be read in different ways by different people? What are the possible interpretations of the requirements? Requirements realism, is the requirement realistic given the technology which will be used to implement the system? Requirement testability, is the requirement testable, that you implement a feature, and is it possible to actually test this feature? So these are the different things that you can have in that checklist. So the first thing that that you can have is the premature design, that whether the requirement that you have written, whether you have tried to where the user has suggested some premature design as well. So that is the first kind of a problem. And then the other checklist, that whether this requirement is it a single requirement or is it a combination of requirement. For example, let's say registration on the system. So a student should be allowed to register the system. Now this registration requirement can be broken down into multiple small requirements. Okay, and then unnecessary requirement, for example, you do not want, you only want to identify those requirements which you can do in that limited amount of time and resources, as we discussed. So if there is something which would mean that you would end up wasting too much time on something which is not of high priority to all the stakeholders, or it is not matching to the goals and objectives that you set in the initial stages of requirement elicitation, then you also identify that, so that you can have a checklist for that as well. And then you can also try to identify that that what kind of platforms the organization has or your client have, or what kind of softwares licenses that they have. So if a requirement means that they would need to move to a different hardware or to a different software, then you also try to identify those requirements as well. And you also, as we said, that this conformance with the business goals, it's kind of similar to those unnecessary requirements as well, that at times people might suggest some requirements which are not actually matching with the goals and objectives that maybe the project sponsor has. So you want to identify those requirements as well. And ambiguity is a very important concern, that as I said, that if somebody suggests that requirement should be easy to use, then that is an ambiguous requirement. Why it is an ambiguous requirement? Because for different people, ease of use might mean different things. Okay. And you want a consistent definition of ease of use, so you don't want it to be ambiguous. So you can also have a checklist for that. Then realism is very important, that whatever technology that you're going to use, whether it can be done in this, you can think about a very ideal solution. For example, as I said, going back to that student attendance problem, now you might say that, okay, I would take a picture and I would do, I will apply an object identification algorithm, and through that I will like a pattern matching algorithm, and I will try to identify the students, and I will automatically mark their attendances. But for that you require certain platform, because for that you require lots of cameras positioned in different ways, so that it captures the faces of all the students sitting in a big classroom. Now let's say the university where you're going to deploy this solution, it has only one camera, and that is in front of the class. Now it is not possible to get a very reliable solution based on that one camera. So what it would mean is that it is not a realistic solution to this problem, because what it would mean is that that university has to put some more money into the solution, and they would have to buy some more cameras, and it will involve more cost, so it's not an ideal solution. So whatever requirements you elicit, you try to gauge that whether they can be done through standard hardware and whether they can be realistically done. Then the final thing that you check is that whether requirements are testable. So you have identified lots of requirements. Now you want to ensure that each one of those requirements is testable and user can actually test. And so because when we validate a system, then or the system's testing is done always against the gathered requirements. So if a requirement cannot be tested and you cannot show it to the client that this feature is done, then you will, if your client is a troublemaker, then he will never accept the product and he will never make you that final payment, because he will say, okay, no, this requirement is not tested. So it's very important as a requirement analyst to identify all those requirements which are not testable, because each statement that you write as a requirement in the specification document, it should be testable. Okay, another important thing that we do in analysis is requirements interaction. What is requirement interaction? It's kind of relationship between different requirements. You try to model that. Let's say you have 4 or 5 different requirements, R1, R2, R3, R4, R5. You try to identify that how these different requirements they interact with each other. How R1 impacts R2, R3, R4, and as many requirements that you have. So you try to identify that how these different requirements, they are conflicting and whether they are overlapping or not. So what you can do is you can make an interaction matrix which shows how requirements interact with each other. Requirements are listed along the rows and columns of the matrix. So for example, what you can do is you can have this matrix like structure where you have requirements written here. So you have R1, R2, R3, R4 here, and you have R1, R2, R3, R4 here. Okay, so for example, R1 and R2. Now let's say R1 and R2, they have a conflict. So what you can do is you can put R1 here. Now if they are overlapping, R1 and R3, they are overlapping, you can put a 1000 here. And if there is no relationship between R and R4, you can put a 0 there. Okay, so you can make your own standard that how you are going to record different kind of interactions. But when we are trying to identify interactions, then there are 2 or 3 things that we identify. Number one is that whether there is a conflict between 2 requirements or whether they are overlapping. Okay, so you can also identify that whether they are dependent on each other or not. So you can make a different symbol for it. You can assign a different number for it. So this is not the only way of recording interactions. You can say that this means they are overlapping, and this circle means that they are independent, and I don't know, this minus sign means something else, it means a conflict. So you can make your own way of representing different kinds of interactions. So this is just an example of that interaction matrix, that you have different requirements here, and you're trying to record. Now in this particular case, R1 and R3 they are overlapping. So we have written 1000 here, and R1 has a conflict with R5 and R6. So it is shown as these one here, where R1 has nothing to do with R2 and R4. So we have written zeros here. So this 1000 means that they are overlapping, and it means that they have conflicts, whereas these zeros, they identify that they are independent. Right? So it is very important, and we are going to talk about it in more detail when we move to our discussion on requirements management. That one of the things that we discussed with requirements is that requirement change a lot. Requirements, there are lots of requirement changes which are introduced by the client. Now, when we are doing this requirements assessment, then it is very important to understand how, if I change, for example, R1, if I would have made this interaction matrix, I would know that which requirement is going to impact which other requirement. And it is very important to, whenever a change request comes in, it is very important to understand the impact of that change. And we are going to, talk about it in our later lectures as well. But in the elicitation process, when you are trying to identify those problematical requirements as well, you are trying to identify different conflicts as well. Now interaction matrix here, the purpose of interaction matrix is to identify all those conflicting or overlapping requirements, because you don't want anything. You don't want different opinions about different requirements written. You don't want different opinions about a solution expressed in different sentences. Okay, so if there are anything which is overlapping in two requirements, you want to resolve that. If two requirements are conflicting, then interaction matrix is a very useful way of identifying those conflicts. So we have said we can also do it through checklists, and we can also do it through interaction matrix as well. So that is it from today's lecture, and let's quickly summarize what we have done in our lecture today. We have discussed some more elicitation techniques, and we've also talked about what is requirement analysis and why it is necessary to do analysis during elicitation. So what are the elicitation techniques that we have discussed today? We talked about questionnaires. We talked about document studies. We talked about focus groups. We talked about brainstorming. We discussed collaborative requirement gathering, and we also discussed quality function deployment. But the most important thing which I want you to take home from all these discussion on requirement elicitation techniques is that as a requirement analyst, you should know what tools or what techniques you have in your hand to elicit requirements in a better fashion, because all these techniques, they're meant to be used with each other. They complement each other, so these are not mutually exclusive. You can use questionnaires, interviews, and document studies all at the same time when you are eliciting requirements. So what do we do when we are making these questionnaires? We said that there are two ways in which questionnaires can be used. It can be used for opinion studies as well, and it can be used for testing your assumptions. And as I said, that as a requirement analyst, then before you go for those specific interviews, you want to get a general feeling that what are the main problems which are being faced by different stakeholders. So you can do a kind of a survey through this questionnaire, which would be very useful for you to conduct maybe focus groups or brainstorming sessions. So next up was document studies, and we said that anything that you have, you can get your hands on, and it can be the interviews that you have conducted. And as I said, that the information in the interviews is very raw. If you want to get some useful information from those interviews, then you need to prescribe them and carefully look at what was the discussion, and after the careful analysis of those interviews, only you can then identify some set of requirements from them. And you can also use any other information that you have. So for example, any information that from the old databases you can get, any screen dumps that you can get of existing systems. So all that information you go through, and then you try to elicit some more requirements from those existing documents. Then we talked about two more techniques, which were focus groups and brainstorming, which are kind of, you can call them a subcategory of collaborative requirement gathering. What we do in them is that we have lots of different stakeholders. We ask them to sit together, and then we try to elicit requirements. There are few differences in brainstorming and focus groups. Brainstormings are kind of more informal, whereas focus groups, they are more formal. And as I said, that you will normally conduct a brainstorming session for a solution which is very radical. Or for example, in an existing, as we gave the example of the automated attendance, then this is not very easy to, it's not very easy to conceive a very realistic solution which will save the time and which will be very efficient. Now you can conduct a brainstorming session for that, whereas for example for the registration problem or for the other problems, you can have those focus groups, because in the focus groups what you want is you want to give a general agenda to people, and you want them to come up with their problems and identify what according to them is a good solution, and prioritize their issues. And so there are slight differences between the two, but more or less they are the same, because you have lots of stakeholders sitting together and you're trying to elicit requirements, and that is what we do in collaborative requirement gathering as well. And there's always a facilitator in those sessions, and you also try to record everything that the different stakeholders are suggesting. Another important thing that I said that was that collaborative requirement gathering is kind of modernized as well in today's IT environment, that people can conduct these sessions in virtual environments where people are sitting in chat rooms, or you have portals, or you have blogs where you are sharing these things and you're trying to elicit requirements in a collaborative fashion. Then we also talked about a technique, quality function deployment. As I said, it is kind of a very ideal way of identifying and resolving conflicts and prioritizing different features and different customer wishes based on the competitor analysis. So you benchmark yourself against your competitors, and you try to resolve those conflicts between different requirements, and so that is the purpose of quality function deployment. So these are the different techniques that we have discussed in today's lecture. Then we talked about why analysis is important in the elicitation stage, and why it needs to go hand in hand with the elicitation, because when we are eliciting requirements, then we are also writing lots of we are trying to elicit, we write everything that we have gathered from different clients, but in that process we write lots of requirements which are not necessary, which are not realistic, which are not testable, which are ambiguous, which are incomplete, which cannot be done in the limited resources that you have. So what you want from this elicitation process as a work product, you want a set of requirements that are doable, which are consistent, which are complete, and which are testable as well. So you do this analysis checking to identify all those problematical requirements, and then you take them back to the client. You have small negotiation as well, where you try to say, okay, these are my final set of requirements that I have gathered from this elicitation process. So that's why analysis needs to be there alongside the elicitation. So that is it from today's lecture. In the next lecture, we are going to briefly talk about negotiation, and as I said, we are going to talk about different elicitation, different modern techniques, or different techniques which have been proposed by researchers for eliciting requirements. But remember that all those techniques which are being proposed by different researchers, they are kind of taken or adapting these existing techniques, and they have modernized them, or they have identified innovative ways of of using those standard techniques. So as a requirement analyst, you should have knowledge of all these techniques, because all these techniques, they complement each other. I just want you guys to take this message from this discussion on requirement elicitation techniques. So take care, and Allah Hafiz.